December the 20th, 1989. 27,000 US troops descend on Panama City. It's the biggest American invasion since the Vietnam War. Their mission? To capture one man. Panama's military dictator, Manuel Noriega.
The United States became enraged at this two-bit dictator who was defying it.
US soldiers scour Panama City, hunting for Noriega. But he's nowhere to be found.
He basically goes into hiding.
Noriega's turbulent six-year rule has been marked by violence, deception, and excess.
He was willing to do just about anything to get ahead.
He was not only corrupted by power, but he's also corrupted by greed.
He was a gangster. Basically a gangster in a military uniform.
How did a kid from the slums become the dictator of Panama? And what did he do to provoke an invasion by the world's most powerful nation?
Dictatorships have had an incredible impact in the past century.
These dictators ended up learning from one another.
They're all different, but many use the same tactics.
The use of terror,
propaganda,
control the elite, create an enemy, cult of personality,
use violence.
These are tools that dictators use to stay in power.
Manuel Noriega's rise to dictator is a near miracle, given the dire circumstances of his childhood. He is born in Panama City in 1934. Orphaned by the age of 5, Noriega is raised by his godmother in the rough market area of Terraplén.
Young men born into the social strata where he was born, their life chances of rising to prominence and power was very limited.
As Noriega grows up on the mean streets, he's picked on for his small size and his acne-scarred complexion. But he finds a way to improve his lot in life.
Noriega saw himself as getting ahead through education. He was incredibly intelligent, good student, somebody who always excelled at his classes.
Noriega applies himself and wins a position in Panama City's best high school. Like many other Panamanian students in the early 1950s, he is swept up in a wave of anti-American sentiment that stems from the US ownership of the Panama Canal. It's a conflict that will play a key role in his life and set the stage for his eventual dictatorship. In 1903, America wins the right to build the canal, a reward for helping Panama win its independence from Colombia. The country becomes a fledgling democracy, but in a climate fraught with tension.
The treaty that gave the United States the authority to build the canal gave the U.S. control in perpetuity.
The canal opens in 1914 and transforms international trade by linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It generates more than $20 million a year for the United States, with Panama making just a fraction of that.
It became a source of irritation because the United States created what in essence was a US colony in the midst of our country.
It's called the Canal Zone, a strip of land on both sides of the canal occupied by some 57,000 Americans, mostly military.
That fueled a tremendous level of resentment toward the United States.
The tide of resentment fans Noriega's growing nationalism. Graduating high school, he boldly declares his ambitions.
If you look at his yearbook, he says, "My ambitions are to become a psychiatrist and the president of Panama."
But Noriega's aspirations are nearly impossible thanks to Panama's class structure. He comes from Creole heritage, a mix of African and European ancestry. The Caucasian elite, just 10% of all Panamanians, have held the positions of power in the country since it was founded. And when Noriega tries to become a doctor, the harsh reality hits home.
He didn't get into medical school because the medical school had a limited number of seats, and they were almost all given to the white upper-class kids from the other part of town.
But Noriega is still driven to get ahead. And when he runs into a friend who's in military school, he decides to follow another route, one taken by many would-be dictators.
It is quite common for dictators to rise up the ranks through the military and eventually, through means of a coup, establish themselves as dictators.
In Panama, you simply don't have very strong political organizations in general. And so the military will tend to loom large in settings like that. So if Manuel Noriega could truly command the military in Panama, he also could command the country.
But in 1958, the 24-year-old Noriega is a long way from commanding Panama's army. He catches a break when he lands a scholarship to a prestigious military school.
He was very well adapted to military life because of the kind of intelligence he had. He's somebody who sizes up a situation, sees where the best alternative is, and very decisively goes for it.
After graduating in 1962, Noriega joins the National Guard, Panama's military force. Months later, he's stationed in Cologne as a second lieutenant. It's there that he meets the man who will take him to the brink of power. His commanding officer, Major Omar Torrijos.
Torrijos was an attractive, charismatic figure. And he was idolized by members of the military, and Noriega idolized him.
Torrijos is a populist. His dream is to recover the canal for all Panamanians. But to make it a reality, he needs power.
Torrijos was very ambitious. His goal was to become the head of the country.
He assigns Noriega to the National Guard's intelligence branch, later known as the G2. Noriega gets intelligence training at the School of the Americas, a US-run combat school in the Canal Zone. Its goal is to help its students fight the spread of communism in the region. But critics say it offers instruction blackmail, coercion, and torture. Some call it Dictator School.
Noriega discovered his vocation as an intelligence officer, and he was described by his course commander as outstanding. So Torrijos basically bet on this young officer, and Noriega became a very, very effective officer for Torrijos.
Every great leader needs a henchman, somebody to do the dirty work. And Noriega was perfectly willing to be that henchman. Noriega was behind the scenes, eavesdropping on opponents, repressing opponents, cracking heads.
Over time, Noriega becomes basically the right-hand man for Torrijos.
By 1968, Noriega has helped make Torrijos one of Panama's most powerful military leaders. But the National Guard still answers to the politicians. Like the newly elected president, Arnulfo Arias. And Arias is worried that the military's political strength could topple the country's fragile democracy. He launches a plan to strip it of power.
Immediately after becoming president, he essentially began a purge of the National Guard.
Arias informs Torrijos he is sending him to El Salvador as a military attaché. Without Torrijos, everything Noriega has worked for could be lost. For Manuel Noriega and his mentor, Omar Torrijos, the quest for power has hit a roadblock. Panama's new president, Arnulfo Arias, has ordered Torrijos out of the country. But on October the 11th, 1968, Torrijos turns the tables by leading a military coup. Noriega plays a key role by shutting down radio and telephone stations in the Chiriquí province, Arias's power base. Arias has no way to get help, and Torrijos quickly takes control. Omar Torrijos is now Panama's military dictator. Noriega reaps the benefits when Torrijos promotes him to Chief of Military Intelligence, the head of G2. The kid from the wrong side of the tracks is now Lieutenant Colonel Noriega. His new position opens up a clearer pathway to power, one taken by many dictators on the rise.
Coming from an intelligence background is incredibly important in any kind of dictatorship because you know exactly what is happening. You know who the threats are and you know what to do about those threats.
As a chief intelligence officer, you are in fact also one of the most powerful individuals. And that is essentially the key to Noriega's power.
Noriega is now the eyes and ears of the regime, and he uses the information he gathers to crush Torrijos' rivals.
Noriega had a free hand to do what he wanted, and he was ruthless in basically cracking down on the opposition.
Rumors circulate about Noriega's involvement in several disappearances, like Hector Gallego, a young priest who angers the regime in 1971 by organizing the peasants politically.
Gallegos was arrested and last seen in military custody. There was a report that he was beaten up so badly that his face was distorted and that they couldn't then bring him back, and so they threw his body out of a helicopter into the ocean. His body was never found.
But for many, there is little doubt who is responsible.
Y yo no pongo las pruebas, pero para mí fue Noriega que lo desapareció.
And that's why Torrijos called him my gangster, because when he had to kill people, he killed people. There's no problem.
But Torrijos' loyal soldier is up to something behind the scenes. He's using his position for more than just crushing the regime's rivals.
There's clear evidence that Noriega's allegiance was not necessarily to Torrijos, but to himself.
Noriega has developed a clandestine relationship that will define his dictatorship in the decades to come. He has been secretly working as a paid informant for the United States.
In the United States, there was this fear that revolution was in the air and that it was being propagated by Cuba.
Since Fidel Castro took power in Cuba in 1959, the US has feared that communism will spread all the way up to Mexico. Central America has become a Cold War battleground.
And so for the United States, the ability to gain intelligence on these groups was essential to fighting the infiltration of communism in the US backyard.
Noriega provides key intelligence on the region's communists and becomes a US spy.
He was providing information about student activist groups, left-wing groups in South America.
He was getting payments from the CIA to operate all of the things that the United States needed him to do for them, including intelligence and wiretaps of people all over the place.
By the mid-1970s, Noriega is the most important asset the US has in Central America. But little do they know, he's not just spying on the Cubans for the US. He's spying on the US for the Cubans.
Noriega was somewhat of a double agent, and he was exchanging information between the US intelligence and passing it on to the Cuban intelligence and so forth.
Noriega relished the ability to do intelligence operations. He loved it. He loved the game.
Noriega is a master at maneuvering through a web of complicated relationships. At the height of his intelligence game, he's selling information to as many as 10 different governments.
Noriega manages all of this, I mean, like the octopus with many hands. And it was in his own interest more than it was for any ideological purpose.
Noriega's growing power and influence within the nation don't go unnoticed. A US Department of Defense intelligence report declares Noriega the possible future dictator of Panama. Even Torrijos begins to feel uneasy.
Torrijos needed him, but feared him at the same time, because he felt that any time he might turn on him.
Noriega may be one of the most powerful men in Panama, but his climb to the top is about to be threatened again. In September 1977, Torrijos signs a historic treaty with US President Jimmy Carter. It guarantees that Panama will gradually gain control of the canal and its revenues over the next 22 years. It's a huge victory for the people, the country, and Torrijos. But it could be a disaster for Noriega. During the negotiations, Torrijos promised to transition to a democracy.
Noriega saw that process of opening as dangerous. Dangerous to the ability of the military and of himself, probably, of maintaining control.
And Noriega's right. Political exiles who had been expelled by the regime returned to Panama. Free elections are planned. Democracy is in the wind, and it could spell the end of Noriega's rise. But on July the 31st, 1981, an event occurs that changes everything. Panama and its dictatorship have been thrown into chaos. The plane of 52-year-old General Omar Torrijos has disappeared west of Panama City. The wreckage is soon discovered in the hills of Cerro Mata. There are no survivors.
There has always been rumors, never proven, that Noriega had a hand in Torrijos's accident.
But Noriega is officially cleared of suspicion in the tragedy. And as Torrijos's death is mourned by hundreds of thousands, the question is, who will replace him?
Torrijos' death resulted in a leadership vacuum, and that vacuum had to be filled by someone.
As the head of G2 and Torrijos's right-hand man, Noriega has a wide open path to the leadership. All he has to do is take it.
Noriega, being the chief intelligence officer and having the most access to what was going on, the undercurrents of the time, seized the moment to advance his own agenda and rise to the top himself.
By August 1983, Manuel Noriega holds the top military position in the country, commander of the National Guard. Like Torrijos before him, he is the country's de facto leader.
All of a sudden, Noriega's the most powerful man in Panama. And he quoted Torrijos, "The first duty of a man in power is to stay in power."
That won't be easy. Noriega already faces a daunting obstacle. Torrijos promised the US that Panama will hold democratic elections. If he keeps that pledge, Noriega could find himself sidelined. He has a solution. While he rules from the shadows, an elected puppet president will do his bidding.
It was going to be a democracy under the control of the military.
To pull it off, Noriega needs his puppet candidate, Nicolas Ardita Barletta, to win the presidency. But on Election Day 1984, as the results start coming in, Barletta is losing. Until Noriega intervenes, and 60,000 opposition votes mysteriously go missing. Barletta becomes the president, just as Noriega had planned. On the surface, Panama appears to be a democracy, but Noriega holds the real power. He controls the military, the government, and the economy. And he immediately sets out to reap the rewards.
Amassing personal fortunes for dictators is a symbol of prestige, of grandiosity, and even invincibility. That hoarding aspect of taking and extracting revenue and wealth from society and using it for your own purposes is a hallmark of most dictatorships.
In the early 80s, Noriega sees a new way to turn his power into money. He strikes a deal with Pablo Escobar, the leader of Colombia's Medellin drug cartel.
Tons of cocaine were being produced in the jungles of Peru and Colombia, and they needed ways to get the material through to the United States or Europe or any place else.
Drugs begin to fly in and out of Panama, and he starts to make $150,000 per flight.
Over the next few years, Noriega will pocket an easy $10 to $15 million. And soon Noriega's not just running drugs, he's running arms for the Americans. The Reagan administration is arming the Contras in Nicaragua and other anti-communist rebels in Central America.
He's involved in transporting arms back and forth to the various fighting forces in Central American civil wars. So he is now becoming a key person in the clandestine business happening in Central America.
But Noriega's schemes don't go unnoticed. Hugo Spadafora, a hugely popular leftist revolutionary, has learned of his illicit activities, and he's publicly denouncing him.
Hugo Spadafora was a tall, handsome, Italian descent Panamanian. I call him a romantic revolutionary. And he is going on television saying Noriega is a dictator, Noriega is a drug trafficker, Noriega is repressing freedoms. Noriega is furious.
Noriega is further enraged in September 1984, when Spadafora takes his claims to the opposition newspaper, La Prensa. The article's impact is felt far beyond the borders of Panama. It even raises eyebrows in the White House. Up to now, the US government has kept a blind eye to Noriega's drug trafficking because of his help with intelligence and running arms. Now the US is forced to at least appear to take some action.
The United States does make it known that we have heard that you're involved in drug trafficking, and that's a really, really bad thing. Noriega kind of salutes and says, okay, I'm out of it.
But Noriega's just playing the US. He merely reduces his role in trafficking drugs. And he discovers a way to profit even more from the cartels by laundering their money in Panamanian banks. US drug smuggler Stephen Kalish has millions of dollars of dirty money and nowhere to clean it. He's hoping Noriega can solve his problem.
I met Noriega. He told me that he thought that everything that I was looking for I could find in Panama. He provided me a safe banking haven. It allowed me to bring in $25–30 million that had been sitting in a house in Tampa, Florida.
And Kalish is just the tip of the iceberg. Noriega hauls in about $10 million a month by laundering the cartel's money, totaling as much as $350 million by the early 80s. After amassing his fortune, Noriega enjoys it to the fullest. He splurges on luxury cars, mansions, and estates all over the world.
He lived a lavish lifestyle. He had very beautiful women flown in from the US. It was extremely festive. He was fun to be around.
El deleite del poder. Trabajaba como un padrino, ¿no?
Noriega's the wealthiest man in Panama, but he still doesn't have what he desperately wants: respect.
If there's one thing that he wanted was to be seen as being a Panamanian nationalist in the way that Omar Torrijos was seen, and a figure to be honored. But he was never going to be seen as the charismatic, swashbuckling, handsome fellow. His physical appearance was always a detriment to that, and it was painful, and it really hurt.
Noriega's nemesis, Hugo Spadafora, is also everything Noriega isn't. And Spadafora's criticisms are turning the people against him.
Hugo Spadafora signaled that he was going to lead an opposition movement against Noriega.
Hugo Spadafora was a real threat to his power. And so instead of keeping him around where he could foment dissent and help civil society groups continue to challenge Noriega, he did something about it.
September the 17th, 1985. The headline in La Prensa delivers the shocking news. Guerrilla fighter and political leader Hugo Spadafora has been murdered. Found in a Costa Rican river, stuffed in a US mail bag.
He was beheaded, and it's said that beheaded alive and tortured horribly. You look at that photograph and you can't get over it forever.
Spadafora was last seen when Panamanian soldiers took him off a bus near the Panama-Costa Rica border. The finger of suspicion points directly at Manuel Noriega.
Yo no tengo pruebas, pero yo estoy seguro que esa muerte la ordenó él.
That was a very important moment where Noriega actually started going downhill.
Panamanians are outraged by Spadafora's murder. 80,000 attend his funeral. And they're even more inflamed when Panamanian officials file no charges in the case. The press coverage of the Spadafora incident has helped mobilize the people. They take to the streets in massive numbers. Noriega needs to find a way to change the narrative.
Dictators want to make sure that the messaging that is going out to the citizens supports the dictator's agenda. So if a free media is relentlessly criticizing the dictatorship, dictators often use the practice of preemption to control the message. And Noriega was really good at that.
Noriega sent his troops in to raid the offices of La Prensa to show them, don't go investigating things that you shouldn't be investigating.
We were receiving death threats on a weekly basis. We had to make a decision. We're either going for it or we're not. And everybody came back and said, let's go.
Noriega's in a real jam. To keep up the semblance of democracy, he can't completely silence the press. And he faces the consequences when a promise he made years ago comes back to haunt him. When Noriega first took power, he made a deal with one of his chief military rivals, General Roberto Diaz Herrera, to give him a turn as leader after 4 years. In May 1987, Noriega's time is up, and Herrera wants in. But now that Noriega's on top, he's not stepping down for anyone.
Noriega, as he was apt to do, double-crossed him and went back on his agreement and basically cashiered Diaz Herrera to some diplomatic post.
But Herrera refuses to go quietly. He takes his story to the press and makes some explosive claims. He reveals that he helped Noriega rig the 1984 election. Even worse, Herrera accuses Noriega of ordering Hugo Spadafora's murder and of planting a bomb on Torrijos' plane. Herrera's allegations trigger mass revolt among the people.
A few days after these revelations, massive protests took place in the streets of Panama City, protesting the regime.
He arrests Herrera for high treason and the angry protests swell to 100,000 people.
It was pots and pans and white handkerchiefs. It was a non-violent movement.
The protesters ridicule Noriega's appearance, calling him Pineapple Face. And the military dictator, enraged, cracks down hard.
He reacted violently. People were jailed and tortured and so forth. It was quite horrible.
The turmoil is broadcast all over the world. A state of emergency is called and lasts for 19 days. It appears Noriega is losing control of the country.
The impact of the Herrera revelations was significant in essentially making it even more difficult for the U.S. to simply look the other way. Politically, it was unpalatable, untenable to give him a free pass.
And the U.S. responds, turning on its former ally. On June the 26th, 1987, the administration calls for Noriega's removal. The Americans try to force him to step down, cutting Noriega from CIA payrolls and indicting him for drug trafficking and money laundering.
There was tremendous efforts to broker some sort of deal and pressure Noriega to leave.
But Noriega isn't going anywhere. Instead, he tries to bolster his dwindling support by fanning the flames of anti-American sentiment among his people.
I think he believed his own myth of invincibility. He had survived double-crossing the cartels, double-crossing the CIA, and he thought he was going to survive.
But Noriega faces another challenge within his own borders. May the 7th, 1989, Panamanians go to the polls to elect a new president. Just like in '84, it appears the opposition is on the verge of victory. Until Noriega steps in and declares his own candidate the winner.
He just names a president. So this is Noriega basically throwing the pretense of democracy out the window.
Panama City is engulfed in protests against Noriega and his regime. He sends in his own paramilitary group, known as the Dignity Battalions, to suppress the protesters. They beat the opposition vice presidential candidate, Guillermo Billy Ford, unmercifully.
You have that famous picture of Billy Ford with his blood-soaked guayabera. Those images were very impactful because the images revealed for the world to see the brutality of the regime.
In the US, the pressure mounts on a new president, George H.W. Bush, to take action. And he makes a public demand for Noriega's resignation. But Noriega isn't listening to anyone in America anymore. Instead, he tries to rally the followers he has left.
The U.S. government pushed him over the edge, and he felt betrayed. I think he reached a tipping point. He actually broke. He was no longer really in control of his emotions.
7 months after President Bush orders his resignation, Noriega condemns the superpower for insulting Panama's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Noriega said that a state of war was developing between the two countries.
It's like he's thumbing his nose at the US for all the world to see.
He played a very high-stakes game in which he defied the US government. There was a saying that the United States is like a monkey on a chain. You can play with the monkey, but don't pull the chain too hard, because the monkey's gonna bite you.
Manuel Noriega's reckless behavior has stretched relations between the US and Panama to the breaking point. On December the 16th, 1989, they finally snap. A Panamanian officer fires on an American car when it runs through a military checkpoint, and a US Marine is killed.
La muerte de ese oficial norteamericano que derramó el vaso.
I will protect the lives of Americans in Panama, whether they're military or civilian. We will not let Americans' lives be put at risk by a dictator down there.
December the 20th, 1989. 27,000 US troops storm Panama City. Their mission, take down Manuel Noriega. US troops destroy Noriega's headquarters as they hunt for him.
The machete-wielding, el man who had defied the U.S., for so many years, basically goes into hiding.
He did not issue one military order. Not one. He just ran and ran and ran. That says a lot about bullies. All bullies are basically cowards.
The American invasion has left more than 1,000 Panamanians, soldiers and civilians, dead. 20,000 are homeless. And Noriega is still on the run. On Christmas Eve, he finds desperate refuge in Panama City's Vatican Embassy.
He believed the Vatican Embassy might provide safe haven to allow him to get out into exile someplace.
US forces are quickly tipped off, but Noriega refuses to surrender. Outside, an unruly mob calls for his head, taunting him with chants of Pineapple Face. January the 3rd, 1990. Panama's military dictator surrenders to the US, but with one condition.
He wanted to surrender in uniform, but the United States then did something that was very humiliating. As soon as Noriega was arrested, they made him take off his uniform, and they took a picture of him with a wrinkled t-shirt, Noriega looking like a common criminal. And that was the picture they put out around the world to show that Noriega was in custody.
After a tumultuous 6 years as Panama's dictator, the boy born with nothing, who once had everything, has just lost it all.
Noriega was incredibly greedy. He was not only corrupted by power, but he was also corrupted by greed. And that ended up being his downfall.
On April the 9th, 1992, Manuel Noriega is convicted of drug trafficking, racketeering, and money laundering. He's sentenced to 40 years in prison. Panamanians rejoice in the streets. 2017. After 25 years in custody, Noriega dies at the age of 83. At the height of his power, Noriega had amassed a fortune estimated at $600 million. Today, while his estates are crumbling, his country is rebuilding.
Panama got the canal back in 1999, and they have run it very successfully, very competently. Panama has become very, very prosperous.
The country has held free elections with mostly stable democratic governments since Noriega's arrest. The abuses of his rule have resulted in a landmark constitutional change: the abolition of the country's military.
That has been instrumental to democratic civilian control. The idea of a coup these days is very far-fetched.
El caso de Noriega sí debe mantenerse para que la juventud que viene subiendo siempre tenga presente que eso ocurrió y que no debe repetirse.